Compare you, I usually don't do this, to Steve Jobs and what he did for computing.
I don't think there is another Steve Jobs. He was a legacy in Silicon Valley of changing the world.
Elizabeth Holmes, visionary or villain? The rise and fall of Theranos. A single drop of blood, a promise of painless answers. A company once valued at $9 billion. Then the headlines turned. A Wall Street Journal expose cut through the myth. Regulators said patient safety was in immediate jeopardy. Courts called it fraud. Elizabeth Holmes, visionary or villain? The rise and fall of Theranos. Do not look away, because the truth behind this rise and collapse will challenge what you believe about innovation, ambition, and trust. Wall Street Journal. If you think this is only a story about a failed startup, listen closer. In October 2015, a quiet investigation broke the spell. It revealed that Theranos did not rely on its Edison devices for most tests. Many patient samples were secretly routed to conventional analyzers behind the lab doors. The public face said breakthrough. The lab reality said something else. The clock started ticking. Wall Street Journal. Soon federal inspectors arrived. In a letter made public, the lab in Newark, California, was cited for conditions that placed patients in immediate jeopardy. Licenses faced revocation. The founder faced a ban from operating labs. The promise that once thrilled investors now carried a different weight. Lives, not valuations, were on the line. Wall Street Journal, Democrats, Energy Commerce, House Gov. Then came the charges. In March 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission said the company raised hundreds of millions on exaggerated claims. Military deployments that never happened. Revenues that existed mostly in slides and pitch decks, not in the books. The numbers did not lie. The story did. U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. By September 2018, Theranos prepared to dissolve. Emails to stockholders spoke of winding down, not breaking through. A unicorn turned to dust. Partners walked away. Test results were voided. The damage was not only financial. It was personal. It was medical. Wall Street Journal. In court, the verdict drew a sharp line. Jurors found Elizabeth Holmes guilty of defrauding investors. A federal judge later handed down a sentence of more than 11 years. Her partner, Ramesh Sunny Bhawani, received nearly 13. Appeals followed. Time kept moving. The stain on the story did not fade. U.S. Department of Justice. Here is the question that matters. Was she a bold dreamer whose ambition outran the science, or a calculated architect of deception? The answer may be both. A culture that forgave exaggeration until it crossed into harm. A board heavy with prestige, light on lab science. A media hungry for a face to crown. A market wired for fear of missing out. These currents lifted her. These same currents looked away when warning lights flashed. Tonight we walk through the rooms where the narrative was built. We will see the black boxes, not in a demo, but under the glare of inspection. We will hear the voices that tried to warn from inside the lab. We will read the letters that regulators wrote. We will follow the money from the first 6 million to the last desperate months. Then we will return to the human cost, the patients who trusted a promise that medicine was not ready to keep. Wall Street Journal, stay with me. In the end, you will decide who Elizabeth Holmes is in your heart. Visionary, villain, or a mirror held up to a system that rewards the story first and the proof later. Elizabeth Holmes, visionary or villain? The rise and fall of Theranos. The truth begins now. Subscribe, because the next chapter reveals the first crack inside the company, the moment a grandson of a statesman chose science over silence. Elizabeth Holmes was born in 1984 in Washington, D.C., into a family that carried a certain weight of history. Her lineage traced back to Charles Louis Fleischmann, the founder of Fleischmann's Yeast, once one of the most prominent family fortunes in America. Holmes's parents often spoke with pride of that legacy, reminding their daughter of the greatness that had once defined their bloodline. From an early age, Elizabeth absorbed these stories as if they were commandments. Success was not just encouraged, it was expected. To fall short was to fail her family's history. This constant reminder became both fuel and burden, shaping a young woman whose ambition would never settle for the ordinary. As a child and teenager, Holmes was intelligent, highly disciplined, and deeply determined. Friends and teachers recalled a girl who never accepted limits. She studied Mandarin Chinese intensively, even spending time in Beijing during high school to immerse herself in the language. She pursued summer programs at Stanford before enrolling there officially, already carving out the path she believed was destined for her to become not just successful, but legendary. Holmes's aspirations were not modest. She often told those close to her that she intended to become a billionaire. It wasn't spoken as a dream, but as a matter of fact. In 2002, Holmes entered Stanford University, majoring in chemical engineering. Just a year later, at the age of 19, she began pitching an idea to faculty: a small adhesive patch that could diagnose diseases and deliver medication directly through the skin. She approached Dr. Phyllis Gardner, a respected professor of medicine. Gardner's response was blunt. The idea, she explained, was scientifically impossible. But Holmes didn't waver. She brushed aside the critique and kept moving forward. That dismissal of expert advice marked an early crack in her path, choosing belief in her vision over the boundaries of scientific reality. By 2003, Holmes had already filed her first patent application. She founded a company originally called Real-Time Cures, built around the goal of revolutionizing medicine. Within a year, she dropped out of Stanford, using the money her parents had saved for her education to seed her startup. In Silicon Valley, that decision placed her in the same archetype as Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Mark Zuckerberg, the college dropout turned visionary founder. For Holmes, it wasn't just a financial move. It was a story carefully crafted to resonate with investors and journalists. She knew the power of image. Holmes adopted a black turtleneck as her uniform, mimicking Steve Jobs. She lowered her voice to an oddly deep baritone, a deliberate performance to project authority in boardrooms filled with older men. She recruited former Apple designers to shape Theranos' machines so they looked sleek, futuristic, almost magical. Everything about her presentation was engineered to reinforce the persona of a revolutionary. She wasn't just running a startup, she was staging a role, and the world was buying it. For nearly a decade, Theranos operated in secrecy, claiming stealth mode while raising money from investors. Then in 2013, Holmes exploded onto the public stage. She graced the covers of Fortune, Forbes, Inc., our Vanity Fair, and the New York Times style magazine. The media didn't just cover her, they celebrated her. She was labeled the next Steve Jobs, but female, a narrative too irresistible to resist. In 2014, Forbes declared her the world's youngest self-made female billionaire, with an estimated net worth of $4.5 billion based on her 50% stake in the company. In 2015, Time magazine named her one of the 100 most influential people in the world. The myth was complete. Elizabeth Holmes was an icon, a savior, a genius. And yet, behind the glowing magazine spreads and TED-style interviews, something else was happening in the labs. Engineers and scientists inside Theranos knew that the Edison device, the company's core machine, did not work as promised. It could not deliver hundreds of accurate tests from a single drop of blood. Results were inconsistent, sometimes dangerously wrong. But the outside world didn't know that. Investors didn't know that. Even the board of directors didn't know that. The disconnect between the public image and the private reality was vast. But Holmes chose to keep telling the story that people wanted to hear. Her ability to secure credibility was key. At Stanford, she had convinced Channing Robertson, a highly respected professor of chemical engineering, to support her. Robertson not only became her mentor, but also her first board member, lending Holmes the credibility she desperately needed. With his backing, she quickly raised millions from investors who were enchanted by the vision. By the end of 2004, Theranos had secured $6 million in funding. The company's valuation soared to $30 million in its infancy, built not on functioning technology, but on Robertson's reputation and Holmes's charisma. Holmes understood that in Silicon Valley, narrative was everything. Investors often bought into dreams before proof, especially when those dreams promised disruption. The blood testing industry was ripe for disruption. LabCorp and Quest Diagnostics dominated a market worth billions, built on invasive venous draws and centralized labs with slow turnaround times. Holmes promised to replace all of that with a finger prick and a tiny cartridge. The idea sounded like the future. And that was enough to silence doubts, at least for a while. But a few voices tried to sound the alarm. Phyllis Gardner, who had rejected Holmes's idea at the very beginning, remained skeptical and later described Holmes as someone unwilling to listen to science. Others in the medical community questioned why Theranos had never published peer-reviewed data, the gold standard for any healthcare breakthrough. Their warnings were ignored. Investors wanted to believe, the media wanted a hero, and Holmes wanted to be the one. By 2014, Holmes had built a powerful facade. Theranos claimed partnerships with Walgreens and Safeway, promising to roll out blood testing centers across America. High-profile figures joined her board: former Secretaries of State George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, and General James Mattis. These men had global reputations but almost no medical expertise. Their presence was not oversight but ornament, an all-star board designed to impress investors and government agencies. The image was flawless: a young female genius leading a company with the blessing of America's most powerful men. It was during this period that Theranos reached a peak valuation of $9 billion. Elizabeth Holmes stood at the center, hailed as the youngest female billionaire in history. Every magazine cover, every keynote address, every glowing headline reinforced the illusion. But inside, employees whispered about failed tests, doctored results, and a company culture that silenced dissent. The story was too good, the persona too perfect, the dream too big. For years, that dream masked the reality. And beneath the dazzling spotlight of media attention, the first cracks were beginning to spread. For years, Elizabeth Holmes projected the image of certainty. She repeated the mantra that Theranos could run hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood. Investors believed, the media applauded. But inside the company, the truth was unraveling. Scientists and engineers working on the Edison machine watched as tests failed again and again. Machines overheated, results fluctuated wildly, and quality control checks collapsed. Employees described outlier deletion, a practice where failed results were simply discarded to make the machine appear accurate. It wasn't innovation, it was manipulation. The labs themselves were split into silos, designed so that no one employee could see the full picture. Engineers rarely spoke to the lab technicians. Technicians who handled patient samples had no access to the broader strategy. This compartmentalization created a fog inside the company. Each person knew something was wrong, but very few could grasp the entire scale. Fear reinforced the silence. Sunny Balwani, Holmes' secret partner and the company's president, became notorious for his temper. Employees recalled him berating staff, sending late-night emails filled with criticism, and demanding unquestioning obedience. Dissent was not tolerated. Those who raised concerns were humiliated or fired. Non-disclosure agreements loomed over everyone, and private investigators sometimes followed employees who left. In this atmosphere of intimidation, speaking out felt impossible. Yet cracks appeared. Tyler Schultz, a young employee and the grandson of board member George Shultz, joined Theranos full of admiration. But what he found shocked him. He witnessed quality control tests that failed, data manipulated to hide the failures, and machines incapable of running the tests they claimed. Tyler tried to raise his concerns internally. Holmes dismissed him. Balwani scolded him in an email, accusing him of arrogance. When Tyler tried to warn his grandfather, George Shultz refused to believe him, siding instead with Holmes. The rift fractured their family and showed how powerful Holmes' charm could be, even against blood ties. Another young employee, Erica Chung, shared Tyler's doubts. Working in the lab, she watched patient samples yield inconsistent results. Machines would signal deficiencies that disappeared in conventional tests. She too resigned, shaken by the thought that real patients were receiving these unreliable results. Her conscience wouldn't allow her to remain silent forever. Outside the company, a few voices in medicine also noticed something strange. In 2015, Dr. John Ioannidis, a Stanford professor known for exposing flawed science, wrote a pointed critique. How could a company valued at billions of dollars not produce a single peer-reviewed paper? In the world of science, silence was damning. But investors ignored the warning, choosing to believe Holmes' story over academic skepticism. The public face of Theranos remained bright. Walgreens clinics were rolling out. Investors boasted of their stakes. Holmes smiled on magazine covers. Yet within the labs, workers whispered that the Edison could run fewer than 20 tests, not the 200 that were promised. Dilution of tiny finger prick samples only made results less reliable. A machine that was supposed to change the world was, at best, a prototype held together by secrecy and wishful thinking. The question lingered in the air: how long could the story hold? How long before the cracks spread wide enough for the outside world to see? If someone had listened sooner, if investors had demanded proof, if the board had asked harder questions, if the media had paused its praise, could the unraveling have been stopped before patients were misled? These doubts, growing louder inside and outside the company, set the stage for what would follow. The cracks had formed, and soon they would burst wide open. By 2015, the glittering facade of Theranos began to shatter under the weight of truth. What had once been celebrated as a $9 billion revolution was on the verge of collapse. And the unraveling came not from competitors or regulators at first, but from within. The moment of exposure arrived when the Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou received a tip from a medical blogger. Curious and skeptical, Carreyrou began reaching out to former employees. What he heard was staggering. The Edison machine barely worked. Most patient tests were secretly run on Siemens analyzers. Results were inconsistent and sometimes dangerously wrong. Employees spoke of intimidation, surveillance, and a culture that demanded silence. Tyler Schultz, still haunted by what he had seen, risked family and reputation to speak to Carreyrou in secret, using burner phones to avoid detection. Erica Chung, equally troubled, detailed the failures to federal regulators. Together, their courage gave Carreyrou the evidence he needed. On October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal published its first explosive expose. It revealed that Theranos' miraculous device was largely a fiction. Investors had been misled, patients endangered. Holmes' carefully crafted myth cracked under the force of documented facts. Holmes fought back immediately. That same night, she appeared on CNBC's Mad Money with Jim Cramer, smiling, composed, and defiant. She dismissed the journal as a tabloid, insisting that great innovators always face resistance. First, they think you're crazy, she said. Then they fight you. And then all of a sudden, you change the world. The performance was bold, but the spell was broken. Regulators soon moved in. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, inspected Theranos' California lab and found deficiencies that posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. One test for the blood thinner warfarin was so inaccurate, it could have caused strokes or internal bleeding. In early 2016, CMS revoked the lab's license and banned Holmes from operating clinical labs for 2 years. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, declared Theranos' blood collection device, its nanotainer, an uncleared medical device. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, began investigating fraud. As the pressure mounted, the human cost became clear. Thousands of patients received voided or corrected test results. Some had been misdiagnosed with conditions they did not have. Others were told they were healthy when they were not. One pregnant woman was told she had miscarried when her pregnancy was viable. Another was reassured her ectopic pregnancy had resolved when it hadn't. Behind the billions lost by investors were lives rattled by false hope and false fear. Walgreens, once a proud partner, quickly cut ties and sued Theranos after investing heavily in in-store testing centers. Safeway, which had built clinics for Theranos tests, abandoned the project, absorbing massive losses. The dream of democratized healthcare, once hailed as revolutionary, collapsed into lawsuits, investigations, and dissolving trust. Inside the company, layoffs gutted staff. Employees who once believed they were part of a medical revolution watched as their work became evidence in criminal cases. Fear turned into disillusionment, and disillusionment into despair. By 2018, Theranos officially dissolved. Its name synonymous not with innovation, but with deception. The tragedy was not just corporate. It was human. Patients were hurt. Families were misled. Careers were tainted. Holmes, once on the cover of Forbes as the youngest female billionaire, was now facing federal charges. Bhawani, once her partner in secrecy, stood accused alongside her. The Silicon Valley fairy tale had become a courtroom drama. What made the fall so devastating was not only the fraud, but the betrayal of trust. Medicine demands proof, transparency, and accuracy. Theranos had offered none of these. Instead, it had built a story so compelling that people stopped asking for evidence. Investors wanted the next unicorn. The media wanted the next Steve Jobs. Patients wanted painless miracles. And Elizabeth Holmes gave them a dream until the dream became a nightmare. The tragedy of Theranos wasn't only that the Edison didn't work, it was that so many people at so many levels chose to believe anyway. And when the truth emerged, it wasn't just a company that collapsed. It was faith in the idea that one person's vision could bend science to willpower alone. The collapse of Theranos set the stage for one of the most closely watched trials in modern corporate history. By 2018, federal prosecutors had indicted Elizabeth Holmes and Ramesh Sunny Balwani on multiple counts of fraud. The charges alleged two schemes, one to deceive investors and another to mislead doctors and patients who relied on Theranos' tests. Holmes' trial began in 2021 in San Jose, California. The courtroom was packed with journalists, curious onlookers, and those who had once celebrated her as a visionary. Prosecutors laid out a methodical case. Holmes had knowingly misrepresented the capabilities of her technology, falsified validation reports, exaggerated revenue projections, and fabricated stories of military use. They displayed emails, investor presentations, and testimonies from insiders who confirmed the company's deceptions. Her defense painted a different picture. Holmes was portrayed as a young, idealistic founder who truly believed in her vision, but was manipulated and controlled by Balwani, nearly 2 decades her senior. Holmes testified that she had been emotionally and sexually abused by him, claims Balwani denied. She argued that she never intended to defraud anyone, that she simply failed while trying to achieve something revolutionary. The jury wrestled with these narratives for months. In January 2022, they delivered their verdict. Holmes was guilty on 4 counts of wire fraud against investors and not guilty on charges related to defrauding patients. The decision suggested that while jurors believed she had deceived wealthy backers, they were less certain she had deliberately harmed patients. Holmes faced a maximum of 20 years on each count, but was ultimately sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Balwani's trial followed months later. Unlike Holmes, he was found guilty on all 12 counts, including those tied to patient fraud. Jurors saw him as the enforcer of Theranos' culture of fear, directly responsible for the company's daily operations and its manipulation of test results. In December 2022, he was sentenced to nearly 13 years in prison. Together, Holmes and Balwani were ordered to pay over $450 million in restitution to investors. Outside the courtroom, the public debate was fierce. To some, Holmes was a criminal mastermind, fully aware of her lies, willing to endanger patients for personal gain. To others, she was a tragic figure, a woman consumed by ambition, crushed by a system that rewarded hype and punished transparency. Gender also fueled the conversation. Critics argued that Holmes had been celebrated as a female trailblazer in tech, and her downfall unfairly cast a shadow on other women founders struggling for credibility. Families of patients expressed anger and betrayal. Investors, including Rupert Murdoch and the Walton family, absorbed staggering losses. Employees who had once believed in the mission now carried the stigma of having worked for one of Silicon Valley's most infamous frauds. A mini twist came in 2023 when Stanford researchers published a peer-reviewed paper demonstrating a way to analyze thousands of molecules from a single drop of blood. Headlines called it Theranos that works. Here, the cruel irony was clear. Holmes' original vision had not been impossible. It had simply been premature. But rather than wait for science to catch up, she had chosen deception. The fallout spread beyond Theranos. The scandal prompted lawmakers to push for stricter oversight of laboratory-developed tests, closing the loopholes that Theranos exploited. Venture capitalists, once enthralled by charismatic storytellers, faced scrutiny for neglecting due diligence in healthcare. The case forced Silicon Valley to ask itself, how much of fake it till you make it is too much when human lives are at stake? By the time Holmes reported to prison in 2023, the myth was gone. The black turtlenecks, the magazine covers, the breathless interviews, all replaced by mugshots and legal documents. The company that once promised to democratize healthcare became a symbol of Silicon Valley's darkest successes. The trial didn't just convict Holmes and Balwani, it convicted a culture that had enabled them. And yet, even in disgrace, Holmes remained an enigma. Was she the visionary who believed too much in her dream, or the villain who lied too easily to protect it? The trial answered the legal question, but left the moral one unsettled. Elizabeth Holmes' story does not end with a prison sentence. It lingers as a parable, a warning, and a mirror. Once celebrated as the youngest female billionaire in the world, she now sits behind bars, her empire reduced to ashes. Theranos was supposed to change medicine forever. Instead, it became one of the most infamous frauds in history. But the question remains, was Holmes only a fraudster or also a victim of the system she embodied? She crafted an image of brilliance, selling a dream of painless diagnostics that everyone wanted to believe in. Patients dreamed of easier care. Investors dreamed of profits. The media dreamed of a female Steve Jobs. Silicon Valley dreamed of another unicorn. Holmes gave them all what they craved until the story collapsed under the weight of reality. The tragedy lies not only in her deception, but in how willingly so many others embraced it. A boardroom filled with statesmen who never asked about lab data, billionaire investors who never demanded peer-reviewed studies, journalists who preferred a perfect narrative over skeptical inquiry. Holmes lied, but her lies thrived because the ecosystem around her allowed them to. Yet the damage was real. Patients received false results, sometimes terrifying, sometimes fatally misleading. Careers were broken, families were torn apart, billions of dollars vanished. And for women in technology, her downfall cast a shadow, proof to some that female founders could not be trusted, a cruel and undeserved stigma that rippled far beyond Theranos. Ironically, the vision itself has not died. In 2023, researchers at Stanford published a breakthrough method for analyzing thousands of molecules from a single drop of blood. Headlines called it Theranos that works. The dream Holmes once sold may eventually be realized, not through fraud, but through science. This is perhaps the final twist. Her idea was not impossible, only her execution. So what do we make of Elizabeth Holmes? To call her a visionary dismisses the harm she caused. To call her only a villain ignores the system that celebrated her rise. Perhaps she is both, a visionary in story, a villain in practice, and a creation of a culture that values hype over truth. Elizabeth Holmes, visionary or villain? The rise and fall of Theranos. In the end, it is not only her story. It is a warning to us all that the line between innovation and deception is thin, and that believing too easily in miracles can carry a devastating cost. And now the question turns to you. In your eyes, who was Elizabeth Holmes? A dreamer who lost her way, or a fraud who never deserved the faith she was given?